Whitney Houston did not simply die in a hotel bathroom. That's the line the public was handed, the neat version stamped into the autopsy file. Easy to accept because it sounded orderly. But nothing about what happened to her was orderly. When investigators finally pushed that door open that afternoon, what they stepped into did not fully match the story the world was later given. The bathwater was almost scalding. The air in the room felt heavy, the kind of heat that clings to your skin. Objects were just slightly out of place, not enough to scream, "crime scene," but enough to make trained eyes hesitate. And Whitney, one of the most powerful voices modern music had ever known, lay there more alone than she had ever seemed on any stage. The autopsy labeled it an accident, but buried in the cold language of that report was one small observation that refused to blend in with the rest. It was a detail that made even experienced examiners pause and murmur. Something about this doesn't add up. This story is not about replaying her final minutes like a spectacle. It's about tracing the years of pressure, damage, and quiet heartbreak that dragged Whitney toward that last moment, and the single clue that forced people to rethink what they thought they knew. Because before Whitney Houston became the voice the world claimed for itself, she was just a girl in Newark, New Jersey, trying to survive in a world that demanded perfection long before she understood the cost. Whitney Houston was born in 1,963 inches, Newark, into a family where music wasn't a hobby, it was a duty. Her mother, Cissy Houston, wore gospel-like armor, her voice already respected in church and studio circles. Her cousin, Dionne Warwick, was moving steadily into the territory of hit records and chart-topping fame. For Whitney, New Hope Baptist Church was more than a sanctuary. It was her first stage, her first classroom, her first proving ground. Colored light from stained glass windows spilled over the congregation as the choir thundered behind her. Young Whitney, slim and serious, stood among women whose voices could rattle the rafters. In that echoing space, she learned how to control a note, how to ride her vibrato, how to breathe in a way that turned sound into something sacred. But she also learned something even more dangerous, that her voice could stop a room cold. Outside those church doors, Newark was still scarred by the uprisings of the late 1960s. Sirens cut through the night. Boarded-up storefronts and burned-out blocks lingered as reminders of rage and survival. That landscape framed Whitney's childhood. By the 1972nd, she was no longer just a church girl. She was following her mother into the nightlife, into bars and clubs where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and arguments drifted over drinks strong enough to sting the back of your throat. From the shadows of those dim rooms, she watched her mother hold the stage like steel, unshaken while chaos hummed around the edges. Sitting in the back, Whitney quietly absorbed a lesson she would never unlearn. Sometimes staying alive meant singing louder than the danger sitting a few feet away. And even in those rough corners of Newark and Harlem, there was something about Whitney that never blended in. By her teenage years, she carried herself with a kind of quiet command. It wasn't naive innocence, it was a mix of softness and heat, a calm surface with fire underneath. When she opened her mouth to sing, the sound didn't just come from her throat. It rose out of something deeper, as if gospel and street grit had fused inside her and were fighting to get out. Then came 1984. Clive Davis noticed her, his gaze narrowing in the way of someone who senses a once-in-a-generation sound before the rest of the room catches up. When Whitney appeared on The Merv Griffin Show, she stepped into a world that would reshape every part of her life. The studio lights were unforgiving. The stage was polished to a shine. For the first time, strangers in suits watched her not as a church girl or a background singer, but as a product in real time. The music industry did not bother to hide its intentions. They told her exactly what they needed her to be. Not too gospel, not too soul. Crossover, always crossover, smooth out the edges, make the sound palatable, make the image safe. It was the quiet start of a war between the Whitney the machine wanted to sell and the Whitney who had grown up in Newark's pews and backstage corners of smoky clubs. The world cheered for the polished star they were handed. But behind each award show standing ovation, another layer of the girl from New Hope Baptist Church went missing. Decades later, that slow erasing would stand out as one of the darkest truths behind her collapse. Her ascent was historic, but every new height carried a new kind of isolation, and almost no one outside her inner circle understood why. Whitney's 1,985 debut album didn't just perform well, it exploded. Around 25 million copies sold, a string of record-breaking #1 singles, and a young black woman suddenly crowned America's pristine pop princess. On paper, it sounded like a perfect victory. But almost as soon as the confetti settled, a shadow narrative began to grow underneath all that success. While white America embraced her, it was said that more and more people within her own community started to question her. Some radio hosts joked on air that she sounded too clean, too polished. Reviewers claimed her music lacked grit. In barbershops and neighborhood conversations, one cutting phrase started to stick: "Whitney's too white." Those 3 words haunted her. Whitney, who learned to sing in a Newark church, who had watched her mother perform in hazy Harlem clubs, was suddenly being labeled a sellout by some of the very people she believed she was representing on the biggest stages in the world. The irony was brutal. The industry had pushed her toward a carefully engineered, mainstream-friendly image. Yet she was the one paying the social cost. According to people close to her, she internalized every jab. Friends would later claim she kept negative articles folded in her purse or tucked into bags, pulling them out alone on tour, rereading them as if they contained a code she needed to crack, trying to understand how achieving global success could somehow make her less black. For Whitney, fame was becoming less like a spotlight lighting the way forward and more like a searchlight aimed right at her, exposing every insecurity. Then came 1991, the night that shifted everything and, at the same time, changed nothing. Whitney walked onto the field at Super Bowl 25 and delivered a national anthem so precise, so soaring, that it instantly became the standard everyone else would be judged against. America erupted. She was everywhere on televisions, newspapers, magazine covers, in living room debates about the greatest performance ever. But inside many black spaces, the reaction was more tangled. Yes, there was pride. How could there not be? But under that pride, some people quietly asked why mainstream America had suddenly decided it was comfortable celebrating this particular black woman. Activists and cultural critics murmured that Whitney was the safe option. The black superstar white America could applaud without staring too hard at the long history of black artists who had been sidelined, exploited, or ignored. The suspicion was not always loud, but it was sharp, and Whitney felt it. She was caught in a space that did not belong to her, but would not let her go. White America cheered for her voice, but never fully understood the streets and church pews it came from. Parts of the black community cherished her talent, but questioned her authenticity, her realness, her cultural loyalty. Somewhere inside that impossible split, Whitney herself started to fade. Her public smile stayed camera-ready, but the fractures were spreading beneath it, slow, quiet, and lethal. Those years were not only her golden age, they were the years when loneliness stopped being a passing feeling and settled inside her like a permanent resident. And that loneliness would follow her to the very end, leaving marks no autopsy report could ever define. Before the world met the superstar, there was the girl from Newark. And before that girl stepped under the stage lights, there was one person who understood her in a way the public never would: Robin Crawford. Their story began in the summer of 1980, inside a community center in East Orange. Whitney was 17, bright, restless, standing on the edge of something she couldn't quite name. Robin was 19, steady, grounded, moving through the world with a calm confidence Whitney didn't yet have. The moment they crossed paths, something locked into place. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about music. It was about connection, the kind that makes two people feel less alone in a world already trying to shape them into something else. According to people who watched them in those early years, they were inseparable. They moved through hallways, streets, and rehearsals like two halves of the same shadow, always nearby, always attuned. Whitney trusted Robin in a way that seemed almost impossible for someone growing up under constant expectation. There was pressure from family legacy, pressure from the church, pressure from the industry just outside the door, and yet, with Robin, she could exhale. Robin wasn't just a friend. She was the person who steadied Whitney when everything around her began to spin too fast. Robin organized schedules, kept track of calls, and watched the backstage doors. She was the one who filtered the chaos, turning down the volume on the noise that fame brought pouring into Whitney's life. Slowly, almost quietly, she became the anchor Whitney gripped when the ground beneath her felt unsteady. But the rest of the world noticed that closeness too. And in an era when rumors about same-sex relationships could end careers, especially for black entertainers, people started to whisper. Those whispers grew into speculation, then into full-blown accusations. According to reports, music executives, image consultants, and even some family members began to worry about how the public might interpret the bond between the two women. They warned Whitney that being seen as too close to another woman could cost her everything she was working toward. For Whitney, that pressure was crushing. Religion weighed on her. It was said that the church community she came from condemned anything outside strict heterosexual norms. Family weighed even heavier. Some relatives reportedly voiced concern about what the friendship would look like from the outside. And then there was the label, pouring millions into her future, demanding control over every angle of her image. They wanted clean. They wanted safe. They wanted mainstream-friendly perfection. No controversy, no questions, no shadows that might invite the wrong kind of attention. In the middle of all that, Whitney made a choice that would scar her in ways no one could see. She chose the world over herself. In what Robin later described as a painfully quiet moment, Whitney handed her a Bible and told her that their relationship, whatever anyone believed it to be, had to change. Not because they wanted it to, because the system around them demanded it. That was the moment when the loneliness that would stalk Whitney for the rest of her life truly took root. Even after they redefined what they were, Robin stayed. For nearly 20 years, she remained at Whitney's side as an assistant, creative partner, emotional guardrail, and, as many people claimed, the only person who could tell Whitney no without fear of being cut off. When Whitney started to spiral, Robin was the one who pulled her back. When doubt crept in, Robin reminded her of the girl from New Hope Baptist Church, the girl who could silence a room with a single note. When the industry pushed her too hard, Robin stepped in, shielding her as much as any one person could. But fame is corrosive. It eats at bonds slowly, then all at once. As Whitney's world got louder, more paparazzi, more travel, more strangers with hidden agendas, Robin's influence began to thin around the edges. It didn't vanish in a single argument. It frayed over countless long nights, missed calls, and slammed doors. And then Bobby Brown walked into Whitney's life, bringing his own gravity, chaotic, unpredictable, magnetic. The two worlds could not have been more different. On one side, there was Whitney's structured, tightly managed inner circle. On the other, Bobby's raw energy, volatility, and the storm that followed him. According to those who were there, their home turned into a battleground of loyalties and resentment, a place where silence could feel as loud as shouting. By around the year 2000, it was over. Robin left the team. There was no public blow-up, no dramatic confrontation caught on camera, just a woman who, as it was said, finally understood she could not keep trying to rescue someone who either could not or would not be saved under the rules of the life around her. When Robin walked away, Whitney lost far more than an employee. She lost the one person who consistently grounded her. She lost the last living witness to the version of herself that existed before the world grabbed hold of her voice and turned it into a commodity. This part of Whitney's story is something no coroner's report could ever capture. It was a slow unraveling that did not begin with drugs or fame or even marriage. It began with the quiet erasure of the only relationship that ever made her feel fully seen. And once Robin was gone, the walls around Whitney didn't just close in. They closed, locked, and, piece by piece, swallowed her whole. When Whitney Houston married Bobby Brown in 1992, the reaction across America was immediate and stunned. She was the polished superstar, the crossover darling of pop and adult contemporary radio. He was the wild spirit of New Jack Swing, unpredictable, rough around the edges, the rebel the industry could never fully control. On magazine covers and talk shows, they looked like opposites forced into the same frame. But beneath the headlines, the marriage made more sense than anyone on the outside wanted to admit. Whitney had spent years being labeled too white, too safe, too carefully packaged. Bobby represented everything the public said she lacked: rawness, street edge, a kind of unapologetic blackness the industry could not smooth out with a stylist and a press release. To some insiders, the relationship looked like Whitney taking back a piece of herself, reclaiming an identity the machine had sanded down. To others, it looked like a fuse burning toward an explosion. From the very beginning, the dynamic between them was volatile. Friends and associates later recalled arguments that started over small things and erupted with startling speed. Jealousy simmered beneath the glamorous photographs and red carpet appearances. According to people who were around them, Bobby struggled with the scale of Whitney's global fame arenas, world tours, awards, and Whitney struggled with his inability to stand in that shadow without lashing out. Their love was real. No one close to them doubted that. But it was the kind of love that burns too hot for too long, leaving charred edges even in the tender moments. By the mid-1990 seconds, the tension inside their home was becoming harder to hide. Some nights the house was reportedly filled with music, laughter, and the ordinary softness of family life: jokes in the kitchen, TV on in the background, their daughter nearby. Other nights turned into storms. Arguments stretching into the early hours, accusations thrown like weapons, doors slammed hard enough to rattle the frame. Whitney, who had once embodied perfect control on stage and in interviews, began to show visible cracks. Those close to her said fame had already isolated her, but marriage didn't dissolve that isolation, it amplified it. Instead of giving her an escape, it boxed her into a smaller, more turbulent world. Then came 1999, the year of one of the most infamous incidents in their shared history. After a particularly bitter argument, Bobby was reported to have destroyed Whitney's clothing, hundreds of outfits ripped, shredded, or scattered across the house. No one suffered physical injury that night, according to reports, but emotionally, it marked a breaking point. People close to Whitney claimed she stayed in her room for days afterward, withdrawn and silent. It wasn't about fabric and designer labels. It was about what the destruction symbolized: rage, loss of control, and a relationship fraying beyond repair. By 2003, things had escalated to a new level. Police in Georgia responded to a domestic disturbance call at their home. The official paperwork, as often happens in high-profile cases, remained vague and measured. But the simple fact that law enforcement had been summoned into their private world said enough. In public, the couple insisted they were solid, still in love, still a unit. Behind closed doors, the foundation was crumbling. It was around this period that Whitney's drug use deepened in a way even casual observers could no longer ignore. Whether she was trying to cope with the strain of the marriage, the suffocating weight of fame, unresolved internal battles, or all of it at once, no one on the outside can say with certainty, but the results were undeniable. Her voice, the instrument that had once seemed almost supernatural, began to show the damage. Notes that she had once lifted with impossible ease suddenly cracked or dropped. Performances turned unpredictable. Some shows were canceled. Others went on. But with a Whitney who seemed only like an echo of the woman who had once dominated the world's biggest stages. Behind closed doors, it was said that friends and colleagues found her increasingly distant, harder to reach, both emotionally and physically. Then came Being Bobby Brown, the reality show that aired in 2005 and marked a turning point in how the world saw Whitney Houston. What was supposed to be a messy, entertaining window into the life of a famous couple ended up exposing something far darker. Instead of the composed legend the public was used to, viewers saw a Whitney who looked fragile, exhausted, erratic. Cameras followed her through airports, living rooms, and arguments, capturing moments that felt less like entertainment and more like evidence of a slow collapse. Scenes that might once have unfolded quietly behind mansion walls were now broadcast as content. Producers later admitted they were not always sure whether they were documenting a TV show or chronicling a tragedy. The Whitney on that screen was not the woman who had once electrified stadiums with a single note. She was jittery, distracted, sometimes loud, sometimes vacant. It was as if the world had been granted an unfiltered glimpse into her private struggle, and instead of turning away, it kept watching. Their marriage officially ended in 2007. The papers were filed, signed, and processed. On the surface, lives separated. Legal custody agreements, new addresses, altered routines. But the damage did not dissolve with the ink. By then, Whitney was no longer the bright young woman from 1985, nor the newlywed of 1992. She had loved fiercely, argued fiercely, and, in the process, lost significant pieces of herself. The scars left by that relationship were not just emotional. They were psychological, spiritual, and, according to those who later spoke about her health, physical as well. They followed her long after the divorce was finalized, surfacing in her voice, her posture, her hesitations, and the hollow spaces in her eyes during certain interviews. No autopsy could weigh the years of that marriage like evidence on a scale. It could not document the nights of shouting, the days of silent distance, the moments of joy that tried to survive between explosions. But the people who truly knew Whitney understood something crucial. Her tragedy was never a single night or a single event. It was a prolonged unraveling, sped up by a love that turned into a battleground, by a household that stopped feeling like refuge and started feeling like a cage, and by a relationship that offered her what the world loudly demanded, authenticity, while quietly stripping away what she needed more than anything, peace. There is a moment in every tragedy when the fall stops being private and the world becomes a witness. By the early 2000s, Whitney's inner life was already splitting at the seams, friendships thinning out, a marriage twisting into something darker, and a loneliness that no crowd, no award, no encore could drown. Behind closed doors, people whispered that Whitney was changing. Some said she was dropping weight too quickly. Others noticed she was canceling rehearsals, arriving late, or locking herself in dressing rooms for long stretches of time. The executives who had once built empires on her voice began asking a question they had never dared speak out loud before. Is Whitney still Whitney? There were nights when she would walk into a studio, stare at the microphone, and lock up not because she couldn't sing, but because she was terrified she couldn't sing like Whitney Houston. That was the standard she had been forced to live inside for decades. Not just good, not just great, but flawless, every time. The pressure pressed into her like a blade. Members of her own team would later recall her pacing hallways, talking to herself under her breath, humming tiny fragments of notes just to see if they were still there. Some nights, she hit them clean. Other nights, her voice slipped, sliding away like wet glass she couldn't hold on to. By 2001, the tabloids smelled blood in the water. Rumors hardened into headlines. Headlines were repeated as jokes. Jokes became ammunition for late-night talk shows. But what the world didn't see was how those words cut deeper than anything that had come before. This time, people weren't calling her too polished or too safe. This time, they were questioning her sanity, her health, her voice, the three pillars her entire existence had been built upon. The pressure hit its peak in 2002. When Whitney sat down across from Diane Sawyer for an interview, the entire country was waiting to watch. She appeared on screen, thin, guarded, eyes sharp and weary all at once. She tried to project control, to sound firm, to keep the narrative in her hands. But the armor cracked. Her voice shook. Her hands trembled just enough for the camera to catch. And then came the sentence that would echo for years. Crack is cheap. The world gasped. Clips were replayed, dissected, remixed into punchlines. More importantly, the world saw what Whitney had tried to keep hidden. For the first time, her struggle stopped being something contained in hotel suites and tour buses. It became a televised artifact, rewindable, memeable, forever. The girl from Newark, the crossover princess, the voice of a generation, was being reduced to a soundbite. The downward slide did not pause there. 2 years later, Being Bobby Brown premiered a show that, in hindsight, probably should never have been made. Cameras trailed Whitney and Bobby through airports, cars, living rooms, and arguments, capturing moments that felt less like reality TV and more like surveillance footage of a family under strain. Viewers watched Whitney laugh too loudly, move too quickly, snap too sharply. They saw her jittery, distracted, exhausted. They saw a woman slipping, but without the language or the permission to ask for help. The Whitney on that show was not the one etched in people's memories from music videos and award shows. And it was painfully clear she knew it. What audiences were watching was not just a messy celebrity marriage. It was the unfiltered decline of a person who had been carrying far too much for far too long. By the time 2009 arrived, Whitney made a move to reclaim herself with the album I Look to You. The world framed it as a comeback. She was hoping for something closer to redemption. But the truth was written into her voice. It wavered. It strained. It reached for notes that did not always land. The pain and damage of decades had settled into her breath, into the muscles that once responded without effort. On the record, you could hear the war between who she had been and who she had been forced to become. Then came the 2010 tour, and the nightmare turned public in a way that could never be undone. On stage, in city after city, she forgot lyrics, missed notes, and cut concerts short. Some audiences walked out. Others cried. Almost every rough moment was caught on shaky phone cameras, uploaded, and replayed with cruel commentary. This was no longer just a decline in a legendary career. This was a woman being peeled open in real time, her struggle dissected under stadium lights and computer screens while millions watched, judged, and rarely understood. And that brings us to the core of her collapse. The years when Whitney Houston, once untouchable, stopped being a shining legend and became a living tragedy, unraveling in front of the world. Those final chapters didn't start with the bathtub. They started long before, on stages, in hotel suites, and inside her own mind. And then, slowly, everything narrowed to 2 days. 48 hours when every signal was flashing red, every warning was right there, and yet no one realized Whitney was already slipping away. By early February 2012, Whitney was holding herself together with whatever pieces of strength she had left. On the surface, she was preparing for Clive Davis's famous pre-Grammy party, an event that had always served as her yearly declaration. She was still here, still standing, still Whitney. But inside the Beverly Hilton Hotel, behind the polished hallways and velvet ropes, something felt off. People who saw her that week described her as restless, emotional, shifting moods like weather. She could be calm one moment and on edge the next. Some said she looked bone-deep tired. Others said there was something almost frightened in her eyes. A few quietly admitted that she seemed nothing like the Whitney they had known in earlier years. On February 9th, the first major warning sign appeared in public. Paparazzi cameras caught her outside the hotel, stumbling slightly, her steps unsteady. Her hair looked damp, her expression tightened, like she was fighting through something invisible. The flashes from the cameras lit up her face in harsh bursts, freezing every flicker of discomfort, every crease of stress. Those photos would later be pored over by fans and critics like clues in an open case file. Witnesses claimed she kept rubbing her arms as if she were cold, even though the Los Angeles air was warm. One staff member later recalled that she kept asking where certain people were, repeating questions she had already asked, as if conversations were sliding out of her memory. Small details. The kind of things that are easy to dismiss in real time, but chilling when viewed in retrospect. The next day, February 10th, the pattern deepened. At some point in her room, Whitney slipped in the bathroom and scraped her hand against a sharp edge. The wound wasn't serious, just a small red gash on her hand, but it was another sign that her movements had become rushed, distracted, out of sync with her surroundings. She was moving too quickly, thinking too slowly, or both. Her team cleaned the cut, bandaged it, and kept the incident quiet. No press release, no dramatic reaction. Just one more secret folded into a long line of things the public would only learn about after it was too late. That night, the tension rose again. Whitney reportedly got into a mild argument with friends about Grammy weekend plans. It wasn't explosive, not the kind of fight that makes headlines. Voices were raised, sharp words tossed across the room, then pulled back. But the exchange revealed how fragile she had become. People close to her said she seemed overwhelmed, bouncing between excitement and agitation, smiling widely one minute, retreating into herself the next. One person later remarked, "Whitney looked like she was fighting something we couldn't see." That's the kind of observation that feels vague in the moment, but lands like a verdict afterward. By the morning of February 11th, Whitney Houston was a storm contained in human form. She woke up early in her suite. According to accounts, she hummed a few notes under her breath, paced the room, picked things up, and set them down again. And then, in a moment that now feels heavy with symbolism, she began to sing. Not a full song, not a rehearsal, just a few lines. Her voice sounded hoarse, thin, worn down. The voice that once electrified, packed arenas cracked on simple phrases. Her assistant would later say it seemed like Whitney was testing herself, trying to make sure the voice that had defined her life was still there, or maybe trying to convince herself it was. Around 2 p.m., her assistant stepped out to pick up clothes and handle the final details for the evening's event. It was a routine errand on what was supposed to be a routine day. No one believed this would be the last time someone who truly cared about Whitney saw her alive. No one paid attention to how dry her voice sounded when she spoke. No one studied the way she kept touching her chest, as if something inside felt off. No one focused on the faint tremor in her hands as she moved around the room. Whitney was finally alone for the first time in days, and for the last time in her life. What happened in the next stretch of minutes inside that quiet Beverly Hilton bathroom is the pivot point of this story. The moment when the final piece of her tragedy slid into place, silently, without an audience, while the rest of the hotel buzzed in preparation for a party meant to celebrate her legacy. 3:36 p.m., February 11th, 2012, a minute that seemed to freeze the world in place. Inside the Beverly Hilton, the building itself throbbed with activity. Makeup artists rushed from suite to suite, arms full of brushes and palettes. Producers argued over sound checks and timing. Assistants juggled phones, schedules, and last-minute demands. Publicists smoothed over emerging problems before they became headlines. It was Grammy weekend. Controlled chaos was part of the atmosphere. No one questioned it. But behind the door of Suite 434, something was off. For nearly an hour, Whitney hadn't picked up her phone. She hadn't answered calls. She hadn't reacted to knocks at the door. Even the music she typically left playing in the background was absent. When her assistant, who had stepped out earlier to buy a dress and prepare for the evening, returned around 3:30 p.m., the hallway outside the room was loud voices, footsteps, distant laughter. But the moment she slid the keycard into the lock, something in her body tensed. The silence on the other side of the door felt wrong, thick, like the air inside had gained weight. She stepped in. At first glance, the suite looked like any other hotel room mid-preparation. The bed was unmade. Clothes were scattered over chairs. A few makeup items lay open on the counter. Nothing looked violently disturbed. Nothing screamed emergency. It was the kind of disorder that comes with getting ready for a major night, not with disaster. Then she heard it, the faint, continuous sound of running water. The bathroom door was pulled mostly shut, just enough for a line of steam to escape into the room. Warm mist seeped out through the crack, carrying the scent of hotel shampoo mixed with something else, something metallic and unsettling. She called Whitney's name once. No response. She called again, louder, her voice tight. Still nothing. She tapped on the door, hoping to hear movement, a voice, anything. Silence answered her. That was the moment instinct took over, raw, primal, panicked. She shoved the bathroom door open. Heat hit her like a wall. The room was clouded with steam, so dense it felt like a sauna left running far too long. The mirror was fogged. The tiles glistened. And in the bathtub, partially submerged in the scorching water, was Whitney Houston. Her body was slumped sideways, one arm floating at an unnatural angle near the surface. The water was still steaming, far hotter than any normal bath, would be hotter than made sense for someone simply trying to relax. The assistant screamed for help, her voice bouncing off the marble and tile. She lunged toward the tub, trying to pull Whitney up by her shoulders, but her hands slipped. The porcelain was slick. Her arms were shaking. Panic had turned her strength into jelly. Within moments that felt like hours, hotel security and medical staff surged into the suite. The first responders would later describe the scene as disturbingly quiet. There were no overturned lamps, no shattered glass, no obvious signs of a violent struggle, but certain small details made them hesitate. A towel lay twisted and damp on the floor, as if it had been dropped or kicked aside in a hurry. A chair was nudged slightly out of place, just enough to suggest someone had bumped into it. A water bottle rested on its side, spilled but not shattered. Tiny, almost mundane things, but in a room that should have been calm, they were like question marks scattered across the floor. A paramedic reached for her wrist. No pulse. Another leaned close, checking for breath. Nothing. They launched into chest compressions, working over the edge of the tub, then moving her as best they could. The superheated water made the entire moment feel dreamlike, as if reality itself had gone soft at the edges. Whitney's skin was still warm to the touch, which briefly confused some of the responders. By the time most people are found, their bodies have already begun to cool. Here, the bathwater had kept her temperature unnaturally high, blurring any sense of how long she had been there. Someone shouted for the water to be turned off. For a second, no one moved. It was as if the room itself was frozen, everyone present struggling to process the fact that one of the most famous women on earth was lying in front of them, silent, motionless. Then a staff member snapped back to reality, reached for the faucet, and twisted it shut. Slowly, as the steam began to thin and the air cooled, the reality of what they were seeing settled in around them. Emergency crews tried again and again to pull her back, cycling through procedures they had done countless times before. But at 3:55 p.m., the attempts ended. Whitney Houston, the woman whose voice had once seemed larger than life itself, was officially pronounced dead. Downstairs, in ballrooms and corridors, preparations for Clive Davis's party continued because not everyone had been told, and some refused to believe the first whispers they heard. Upstairs, the hallway outside her suite filled with hushed crying, frantic phone calls, and stunned, heavy silence. And hanging in that silence was one suffocating question, one that no one in that hotel could answer. What exactly happened in the final minutes before Whitney Houston slipped beneath that water and never came back up? The report didn't explain her pain. It only quantified the aftermath. Once the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office took over, emotion disappeared from the narrative. What remained were numbers, temperatures, organ descriptions, timelines, clinical fragments of a life reduced to data points. No grief, no pressure, no fear, just evidence. The official cause of death was recorded as accidental drowning, with contributing factors that included heart disease and complications related to substances. On paper, it was straightforward. It wasn't presented as a cover-up. It wasn't labeled a conspiracy. It was the medical conclusion. Her body showed indications that she had likely slipped, losing her balance. There was a faint abrasion on her forehead, consistent with striking the edge of the tub. The small scrape on her hand from the day before still marked her skin, a reminder of how off-balance she had already become. Her heart, once strong enough to endure decades of relentless touring, late nights, and performance stress, showed wear that could not be ignored. There was arterial plaque, the quiet buildup of damage over time. Signs of chronic strain were etched into the muscle, like rings marking the age and hardship of a tree. But the detail that unsettled investigators the most, the one they flagged in their own notes, was the temperature of the bathwater. It was measured as far hotter than normal bathing water, significantly above what most people would comfortably use. Even after the tap was shut off and time had passed, the water retained a disturbing heat. That single fact raised questions that no autopsy could fully answer. Had she been fully conscious when she stepped into the tub? Was she simply trying to relax aching muscles, pushing the temperature higher than usual without realizing the risk? Was the intense heat a sign of panic, confusion, exhaustion, or just a careless mistake born from sheer fatigue? There were no signs of foul play, no internal injuries that suggested an attack, no defensive wounds, no physical evidence pointing to another person in that room at the critical moment. What the autopsy revealed instead was something much more tragic. A body that had been in a prolonged battle long before it met the water. Her organs bore the marks of someone who had been fighting for years, fighting relentless pressure, fighting insomnia, fighting emotional trauma, fighting the physical toll that builds up when an entire industry keeps asking for more, even after the human being at the center has nothing left to give. One examiner was reported to have remarked that her body looked like it belonged to someone who had been exhausted for a very long time. It wasn't said as an insult. It wasn't a moral judgment. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet recognition that what finally happened in that bathroom did not start there. Whitney's heart, both literally and metaphorically, had carried too much for too long. And that is where the autopsy failed, not because it was inaccurate, but because it was incomplete by design. It could document the manner of death. It could not tell the story of how she ended up alone in that hot bath hours before a party meant to honor her career. The report could list water temperatures, the condition of her heart, the status of her lungs, the presence or absence of substances, and the estimated time of death. It could not file the years of fear, the battles over image, the conflict between two cultures, the loneliness of a woman trapped between the Whitney the world wanted and the Whitney she actually was. There is no line on an autopsy form for the way criticism cuts deeper when it echoes old wounds. There is no checkbox for the weight of expectation, the strain of constantly performing a version of yourself that no longer feels real. There is no measurement for the slow erosion of someone who gave everything until there was nothing left but the demand to keep going. Doctors closed the file with signatures and numbers. But Whitney Houston's true cause of death was written in everything the autopsy could never measure. The most unsettling part of Whitney Houston's final hours was never what the autopsy revealed, it was what it couldn't touch. Buried among the sterile measurements and medical phrases was a single detail that hung over the case like a riddle. The bathwater was far hotter than anything she was ever known to use. Investigators documented the temperature and moved on, offering no speculation. But the people who had lived beside Whitney, who had watched her habits for years, understood immediately that it meant something more. Water that hot doesn't usually point to crime. It points to a state of mind. It hints at someone no longer fully present, someone moving through a familiar space without the clarity or caution they once had. According to those close to her, Whitney had been unusually restless in the days before she died, moving fast, reacting sharply, forgetting little details, swinging from excitement to exhaustion with almost no warning. When a person reaches that degree of mental and physical depletion, even simple routines can become dangerous. A bath stops being a place to relax and becomes a place where blurred judgment and slowed reflexes can turn fatal. In that sense, the bathtub turned into more than just the scene of her death. It became a mirror, reflecting back everything that had been wearing her down for years. Many people in the Black community who had followed Whitney's journey from gospel roots to global domination later described that moment not as a random accident, but as the collision point of everything she had carried for decades. For years, she had wrestled with sleepless nights, inner turmoil, and the crushing weight of expectation. The scalding water began to look less like a detail and more like a symbol of someone trying desperately to unwind, to quiet a storm nobody else could see, only to discover that her body and mind no longer moved in sync. It wasn't proof of foul play. It was a clue pointing toward collapse. But to understand what really happened in that bathroom, you have to step outside the pages of the coroner's file and into the silent spaces of Whitney's life. The worst injuries she carried never left bruises. They existed in the empty spaces where people who once protected her no longer stood. When Robin Crawford left, Whitney lost more than a longtime companion. She lost balance. She lost structure. She lost the one person who consistently saw her as a human being rather than an asset. As fame swallowed more and more of her world, the demand to stay perfect hardened around her. The crossover success that once lifted her up slowly turned into a cage. Every cracked note, every shaky performance, every whisper that she was finished cut deeper than the last. Because Whitney understood what very few artists ever truly grasp until it is too late. Once the industry decides you are slipping, it stops reaching out its hand. When her voice began to change, when the effortless tone that had defined her for years no longer rose on command, Whitney felt something inside unravel. She wasn't just losing a technical skill. She was losing the very thing her identity had been built on. At home, the fractures multiplied. Trust eroded. Arguments sharpened. The refuge she needed most never materialized. Instead of a sanctuary, she found herself living in rooms filled with tension and unresolved pain. As the years rolled on, she became more isolated than she could have ever imagined, surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. Her exhaustion didn't arrive all at once. It layered itself over her life slowly, year after year, until it became impossible for her body to keep hiding the damage. None of this fit neatly into the categories on a medical form. You cannot label heartbreak. You cannot quantify relentless pressure. You cannot weigh the gradual erosion of a woman who gave everything until there was nothing left but fragments. The official report told the world how Whitney Houston died. But the real story, the human story, lives in everything it could not explain. Whitney's life doesn't truly end in a bathtub or in a folder stamped and filed away in an office. It ends in the questions that still haunt us about fame, isolation, and what happens when an entire system takes more from a person than it ever intends to give back. So now the question turns to you. Looking back over her journey from Newark's church pews to global superstardom, from deep love to deep loneliness, what do you see as the real turning point in Whitney Houston's tragedy? Where do you believe the fall truly began? Share what you think. And if you want more stories that peel back the polished surface of our icons and reveal the hidden truths underneath, stay with us. There are still so many files left unopened, and the next chapter